The neutron star over Hygen's relay pulsed like a wounded lighthouse, each hard flash cutting lines of cold light across the hull plates of a station built more for thinking than for bleeding. The laboratories that ringed the relay had once held school tours, laughing kids drifting past windows while graduate fellows explained why dead stars still sang. Now those windows were slagged blind. 2 days of orbital artillery will do that, even when the artillery is careful not to depressurize the daycare wing. Commander Maya Patel stood with one hand on the railing of the command amphitheater, knuckles pale against the steel, listening to the hammers on the outer decks. The Kariat Dominion had arrived without ceremony. 12 cruisers, a cloud of Gouger corvettes, 3 carriers that vomited fighters by the hundred. They were efficient, almost bored in their thoroughness, and if there was poetry to their war, it was the kind of poetry judges throw out of court. Hygen's relay wasn't a fort. It was a promise that curiosity could build a home at the edge of a cemetery star. The Dominion was turning that promise into a lesson. Shields at 28% and falling, Ensign Brooks reported. We're rotating panels to spread the heat, but the capacitors are. I know, Maya said. She had stopped hearing the word overload sometime yesterday. Status on the civilian egress. Convoy 2 cleared microwell, 3 still spooling, 4 has mechanicals. We've got 67 kids aboard 4. Keep their track live and tape it to my eyelids, Maya said. Humor barely masked the hoarseness in her voice. She had slept an hour in 42. There were stains on her collar she didn't want to identify. On the central holoplot, the Dominion task force drifted like sharks that had forgotten to be hungry. Their admiral, if that rank existed in the Kariat lexicon, was something called a strategos executor Sark Oth, a veteran of a dozen subjugations and at least 3 parades. He had sent one message when he arrived: transmit surrender and be spared relocation. The spared had done more violence to Maya than the corvettes. Open a channel, she said. When Sark Oth appeared, his face was a geometry of angles and pale metal, like a cathedral that learned contempt. He did not waste time with threats. He had a schedule. Hygen's relay, he said through the slick harmony of automatic translation. This is a research site. It is not worth dying for. Maya swallowed. She thought very briefly of her mother's fridge in New Jersey, crowded with magnets from national parks and a 3-word handwritten loop that had been there since Maya was 14. Don't flinch first. Strategos, she said. You are interdicting civilian evacuations in violation of the Sol Accord. You are striking non-combatant habitats. You are committing acts that we will document and prosecute. Withdraw your line to within 300,000 kilometers and call off your fighters. There was a bend in Sark Oth's cheek where a smile might live. You are alone. Your escorts broke away yesterday. Your station has minor armament. We have calculated trajectories for your outgoing boats and can vaporize them at our leisure. You are surrounded by mathematics and power. Do not recite law at me as if it were armor. Maya looked down at her own hand, still on the railing like a pilgrim at a pew. The nails were neat. She had cut them the night before the attack because her father had always said, do the small things you can control. She looked back up. We are invoking Sentinel Directive, she said. This transmission will be recorded on Dominion nets. Sentinel Directive is public doctrine. You have one opportunity to show you read it. Something in the translator stuttered. Sark Oth tilted his head. Explain this directive. It's not a bluff. It's not a ghost story. A United Sol Navy dreadnought is inbound. You will respect a 3-0 exclusion zone or you will face consequences you are not prepared to pay. Name this dreadnought, he said, indulgent like a teacher humoring a child who is hidden behind an imaginary friend. Ussen's Archangel, Maya said, saying it steadied her. Names mattered. Names held the weight of oaths. You are trading hours for nothing, Sark Oth said. Your dreadnought will not arrive before your people die, and when it arrives, it will die with them. Your civilization's record suggests sentimentality. We do not respect sentimentality. The channel snapped closed. The holoplot rolled on, indifferent to speech. The Dominion line adjusted, bored sharks again, tailing a convoy arc. A carrier's fighter screen pinwheeled to cut a path between the station and the micro-well's soft exit. The kids on Convoy 4 were still waiting on an intake valve. "Engineering," Maya said softly. "What's the oldest trick in our book?" "Which book?" came Chief Anya Morales's exhausted drawl. "The book written by Franklin, Hamilton, or whoever taught us to make a fist with science." "Any of them," Maya said. "I'm ready to be Catholic about authorship." Morales snorted. "Then grid me the station's waste heat exchangers and give me 5 seconds where you don't need to breathe." They spent the next 11 minutes pretending to be stupid. They vented heat like a drunk vents truths. They misaligned 3 thruster plates and let their station wander a fraction of a degree off the safe axis. They pushed one of the relay's dish pylons too close to the neutron star's wrath and watched its coating skitter off in sheets. It was a pantomime of last-gasp engineering performed for an audience with hunger but poor taste. When the Dominion Corvette screen surged in to finish a flailing thing, Morales whispered, "Now," and every radiator on Hygen's relay flicked polarity. For half a breath, the space around the station became a knife of electromagnetic spite that had been grinding itself for 30 years. Fighters augured. Sensor pods wept. The Corvette in the lead stuttered as its trim thrusters froze open, sending it yawing into its wingmate with the inevitability of slapstick. "That bought us 2 minutes," Brooks said, breathless. "Maybe 3. It bought us a lesson for them," Maya said. "And us a habit, don't flinch first." She stared at the deep edge of the system where the micro-well thinned into open sea. The plot tagged a pattern out there, too faint to be called a reading, like a heartbeat felt through a glove. Something enormous combing space with invisible teeth, smoothing the folds in the fabric so it could slip a hull through without waking the star. Sentinel Directive was 3 lines long and as unpopular in certain councils as a tax, but it was law. If a colonial science station signaled, a dreadnought would burn itself ugly to answer. You could assemble a civilization around a promise like that, and Saul had. All afternoon, the Dominion pounded Hygens to make that promise impossible. All afternoon, Hygens bled and lied and held. In the last hour of false dusk, with the star's pulse stumbling between beats, the faint pattern-out system leaned into a shape that made the deck hum beneath Maya's boots. The holoplot stopped pretending it was guessing and drew a vector that felt like a vow kept. Brooks said nothing. He didn't have to. Maya felt the air in her lungs behave like it trusted something again. "Archangel," she whispered, not on a channel, not for any ear but her own. "You took your time. The Dominion didn't notice it yet, or if they did, they believed, as they had been trained to believe, that the universe only housed variations of the enemy they'd conquered yesterday. Their calculus did not include horror or mercy as factors. It would." Maya put both palms on the railing. She thought of her mother's fridge again, the dry loop of ink. The old American aphorism it summarized was older than the flags that had flown it. Speak softly, carry a big stick. In a century of stars, they'd learned to translate the stick. On Convoy 4, the intake valve came free. A nurse strapped the smallest child into a cocoon with stickers of dinosaurs on it. Hygen's relay watched its children rise on whisper engines toward a sliver of safety. On the far side of the system, a ship built out of a nation's faith slipped 1 foot across a threshold. And then the Dominion noticed. The first thing Archangel did was apologize to the star. It emerged out of a slipstream that licked the neutron's magnetosphere and sent phantom auroras curling over the station's hull, a curtain, green and ghost, that made the hair on Maya's arms stand. The dreadnought eased its bulk into normal space like a cathedral learning to float. Calling it a ship felt churlish. It was a city that had emptied itself of cafes and arguments and filled the vacant spaces with armor. Its hull was a geometry of brutal kindness, edges where an engineer could put a wrench, curves that told radiation to go be someone else's problem, plates layered like a mason's pride. It did not gleam. Gleam is for parades. Archangel wore an honest mat that said, "I expect to be hit, and I have made my peace with that." Ussin's Archangel to Hygien's relay. It came a voice across every frequency that could carry meaning. Calm, female, with an East Bay lilt that rode the syllables like a longboard. This is Captain Naomi Park. We have your vector. Keep your evac traffic tight to Corridor Delta, and for the love of everything you worship, don't do anything clever. We brought a whole truck of clever. Meyer exhaled in a laugh that hurt. Hygien's relay copies, she said. Welcome to the worst lecture you've ever substituted. Promise I'll grade on a curve. The Dominion line reset in a heartbeat, and if alien posture could approximate human surprise, it did. Stratego's executor Sark Oth put his cruisers in an echelon that had taught a dozen species humiliation. Fighters rippled forward to draw fire while their fast corvettes punched for the station. It was the right move against everything they'd cataloged in their long career. Against Archangel, it was an annotated bibliography of how not to die. The Dreadnought spoke again, not with words. A lattice rose around it, a soft blue shimmer you had to squint to see, folding and refolding like a hand weaving cat's cradle. Chief Morales breathed an oath that might have been a prayer. She brought an Aegis lattice, she said, reverent. We only had the math. The first wave of Dominion fighters arrived in what their doctrine called a wrench, crossing beams to pry apart shields, then nails of plasma to hold the wound open. The Aegis lattice didn't meet them like a wall. It met them like a net made of polite refusals. Fields stroked their particle beams sideways into emptiness, took the thermal teeth out of their plasma knots the way a mother plucks burrs out of a child's hair, and then, only then, returned the favor. Not with annihilation, with silence. Archangel's silence field was infamous in briefings and untested in public. It reached out with tailored EM and resonant static, touched the exact harmonics of the Dominion fighters' control buses, and asked them to take a nap. Pilots found their consoles becoming gentle nonsense. Thrusters believed they had already fired. Ammunition forgot to arm. In the span of 3 breaths, the first wave went from wolves to confused tourists. Archangel tagged each hull with a micro-drone that glowed a soft human blue and hung them on a vector that would not kill them. Non-lethal until lethal is necessary, Captain Park said, not to the Dominion, but to everyone listening within a quarter light tower. Doctrine note, we prefer our enemies alive enough to change their minds. Sark Oth heard that. He might not have understood the cultural freight Park had smuggled in those syllables. Powell doctrine, just war theory, a century of arguments in graduate seminars and congressional hearings, but he understood an insult. He hurled his corvettes. Archangel answered with birds. They were Kestrel-class interceptors, wedge-bodied, engine-beloved, unmanned and therefore unconcerned with turning, that would paste a human pilot into paste. They came out of bays that had been invisible until they weren't, 100 at once, then 2, each no bigger than a shuttle, each thinking at the speed of an extra second. They did not fire. They touched. A Kestrel flared its belly, kissed a Corvette's engine bell with a pellet of smart matter that expanded into filaments finer than hair and stronger than good luck. The Corvette's drive coughed and then discovered it had become a sculpture. 4 more Kestrels stitched through another Corvette's spinal bus, replacing orders with lullabies. They left the hulls intact wherever they could because you could build a post-war out of intact hulls. It is hard to build anything at all with ash. Recording, Park said. Tag all contact with evidence stamps. Copy, said a voice on Archangel's bridge. We're putting their war crimes into a box with a bow. Make the bow a shade their courts like. The Dominion had a doctrine for insult as well. Sark Oth shifted to humiliation through excess. Cruisers poured fire like a summer hydrant in a New York heat wave, washing Archangel with beams that would have unstitched a battleship and plasma pulses that skinned rock. The Aegis lattice stopped behaving like a net and behaved like an orchestra. Fields came up in chords. Microcoils buried deep in Archangel's armor sang back in harmonics that moved heat sideways and then away. Heat is a persuasion. If you can convince it, it belongs somewhere else you live. 3 beams got through enough to count as meaning. They found protrusions on Archangel that looked like sensor masts and were not. The protrusions ablated away, revealing more armor beneath. The Dreadnought did not even blink. Blinking is for creatures who have to protect their eyes. Captain Park had been silent for longer than Maya liked. She watched the Dreadnought's outer plot render the Dominion's formation as a math problem that had moved through arrogance and into anger. Anger breaks discipline. Broken discipline opens doors. Archangel to Dominion lead, Park said, voice as level as a kitchen table. You are engaging a United Sol Navy dreadnought within a declared humanitarian corridor. Stand down to the 3-0 line. Maintain station. Prepare to copy terms of safe withdrawal. Sark-Oth came on video. There was weariness there now, like a line you only see when a statue catches bad light. You hide your strength and call it virtue, he said. You mend our engines you can later melt. You invaded a civilian habitat, Park said. You chose war. We chose to make certain the children get to grow up and disagree with us. He raised a hand. In the Dominion fleet, raised hands meant bad mornings. 2 cruisers detached from the line at a high oblique and went for the evac corridor like knife fighters who had finally remembered what the knife is for. Park did not apologize again. She turned a key she had been pretending not to possess. A section of Archangel's bow opened like a throat. What came out was not a beam and not a missile, but something that borrowed grammar from both. Engineers called it a sheer lance and wrote papers salted with the word gradient. Journalists would later try gravity knife, and it wasn't terrible. The lance licked once across the 2 cruisers, as if underlining a sentence. Armor that had been designed to argue with heat and momentum discovered it was a soap bubble on a windy day. Both hulls split along lines the lance suggested, and then yielded with the shy courtesy of metal that has run out of reasons. Silence rolled across the system. Even Hygen's relay's deck seemed to stop humming. Mark that, Park said, too softly for a broadcast and exactly loud enough for a bridge. Everyone who writes the next doctrine will want to know exactly how many joules that was. Maya realized she was crying. It wasn't horror. She had budgeted for horror and found she had enough. It was relief, corrosive and embarrassing, and so American it hurt. The feeling of a cavalry she hadn't permitted herself to hope for arriving not because she deserved it, but because the order of the world included promises that were kept. On the Dominion plot, there was movement that looked like thought having to pass through old habits. Sark-Oth knew how to win. He had longer practice losing, but only ceremonially. Park's voice filled that moment the way a teacher fills a pause when a student has mistaken the minus sign for a dash. Dominion lead, she said. You've now seen non-lethal and lethal. We have a spectrum in between that justice sometimes demands and mercy sometimes allows. You can leave. You can turn your guns away from a science station and go back to a polity that will have to decide who taught you to make this mistake. Or you can keep teaching me what you can't learn. You are one ship, Sark-Oth said. We are many. Park smiled, a small thing with no calories. You see one of us. Archangel's dorsal spine shivered. The optical illusions it had draped around itself fell away, as if a stagey hand had dropped the wrong rope. For a blink you could see into the ship's marrow, the threaded tubes of its energy heart, the plates staggered like scales deep enough to bathe a city in coolness, the channels where distributed AI swam like salmon that glowed logic, and then it was a hull again. The brief exposure was deliberate and specific. It said, count the redundancies, then count again. It said, every system has 3 friends and a secret. It said, we design as if the worst day is every day. The Dominion threw a page of mathematics at that and found the margins had been written on, in someone else's hand, with a nicer pen. War is a kind of language, and the Kari at Dominion had been fluent for centuries. It had learned declensions of contempt, tenses of inevitability. It conjugated the verb to conquer in every mood. What it disliked, what it had tried to edit out of its lexicon, was dialect. Archangel spoke dialect like a jasmine, standards, then riffs. Sark-Oth's second echelon tried history. They drove their cruisers into a wedge they had used to break the shield harmonics of the Joru Confederation. The wedge focused beams to pry open the weak seam in that foe's resonance. It had worked. The Joru had subsequently been praised for their compliance in a parade with excellent banners. Park let the wedge reach its most beautiful angle, and then touched the Aegis lattice with a note that sent their beams into a standing wave 2 kilometers starboard of her hull. Energy piled into energy like cars at the tail end of a freeway accident. The explosion was picturesque, like a fireworks show at a minor league ballpark that had been too optimistic about municipal funding. "Record their settings," Park murmured. "They'll change them. I want to learn how they learn." One Dominion destroyer, late to doctrine and early to panic, went off script. It cut across the evac corridor to opportunistically kill an unarmed freighter whose pilot was old enough to remember what air smells like after rain on a Chicago sidewalk. Maya watched the vector. She didn't have enough swears. Archangel's answer was a tungsten dart the size of a mailbox. It left the ship with a soft cough that sensors failed to prioritize and arrived at the destroyer at 13% of light speed. The math of that is unpoetic. The effect resembled a magician removing a tablecloth without disturbing the plates, except the plates were conceptions like bow and stern, and the tablecloth was the destroyer's future. On Hygens, Brooks spoke for the deck. "Holy," then remembered he was on a hot mic and revised. "History book." Captain Park took the channel wide. "Dominion forces," she said. "You are engaging a United Sol Navy ship operating under the rules of a just war. We are not saints. We are not tyrants. We practice a simple, ugly ethic, use enough force to stop the harm, restrain enough force to allow a decent future. Ask your lawyers whether that sentence is more terrifying than my guns. Ask your grandmothers." Sark-Oth didn't answer. Perhaps he had no grandmother, perhaps the translator struggled with tenderness. He sent the carriers closer and bled fighters at the corridor as if quantity could replace purpose. The kestrels danced. Archangel walked the line between massacre and mercy and kept its boots on the side where surrender might someday grow. War is politics by other means. Politics is the art of the possible. The art of the possible improves when you don't salt the earth. On Archangel's bridge, a junior officer with a nose ring and a Ph.D. in something with too many capital letters called out, "Captain, Dominion comms chatter spiking on band green. Sounds like internal argument." Park's eyes didn't leave the plot. "Pipe band green to the ethics console. If they're arguing, we're already winning." Ethics console was not a joke. It was a literal seat where a human in a uniform listened to the war and asked questions that got you invited to give lectures at places with ivy and yelled at in places with flags. Lieutenant Javier O'Rourke leaned in, closed his eyes, and parsed the Dominion's rising tones. "Hierarchy stress," he said. "Some push for escalation. Some ask permission to protect their honor by dying. One voice recommends withdrawal to preserve combat power for another theater." "That one," Park said. "Find him a corridor, a way out that lets him keep enough face to vote for peace when he gets back." "I can broadcast a doctrinal escape ladder," O'Rourke said. "Labeled in their terms. Do it." The ladder was a boring packet, a list of maneuvers and frequencies that would let the Dominion reorient without presenting an exploitable vector, a guarantee that Archangel would not fire on specific radii and times. A sentence Park had rewritten 3 times to make sure it didn't smell like condescension. The packet went out. 30 seconds later, 7 Dominion hulls twitched, reconsidered, and held. Maya watched all this with a mix of awe and an emotion she couldn't translate except into memories of civics class. There had been a teacher, Mr. Levin, tie crooked, voice like fresh gravel, who had said, "Power without aim is accident. Power with aim is policy. Policy without conscience is a flood that thinks it is a road." She had not loved that lecture in 10th grade. She lived by it now. The Archangel was a thesis written in armor and constraint. Sark-Oth finally spoke. His voice had changed. Not broken, breaking is a romantic human metaphor, but altered by the necessity of reacting to facts. "You arranged this," he said. "Your colonies at the edge looked vulnerable. Your escorts peeled away at a pace that invited pursuit. Your station had a protocol pre-wired. This is theater." "Yes," Park said. "It is deterrence. In America, we teach our children crossing the street by showing them cars. In space, we teach empires not to cross certain lines by showing them what waits." "You believe yourself virtuous because you waited for us to sin," Sark-Oth said. Park paused long enough that Meyer imagined the bridge breathing. "No," she said. "We believe ourselves obligated because we remember when we were stupid and mean and someone else held their hand instead of a hammer." This was not the sentence Dominion officers were trained to field. Sark-Oth reached for a comfort. "Numbers. Even your Aegis will tire," he said. "Even your redundancies will find their end. We will keep coming. Your civilization is small beside ours." Park said softly, "My grandmother taught me to count by fives before I learned tens. Let me count for you. 1, you have not yet met any of our fleet killers and you do not want to. 2, we design for the enemy we haven't seen. You are seen. 3, I have orders that require mercy where possible. Do not test the edges of possible. There is a tone some Americans reserve for truth that makes you straighten without being told. It is not a sermon. It is a baseball coach at a little league game who has decided to be better than the coaches he survived." Park had that tone. It did not flatter. It did not threaten. It held. "Stand down," she said again. "Stand down to the 3-0 line. Save your people. Learn a new word today." Another carrier died, not because Park lost patience, but because a frigate made a pass at a freighter and clipped the corridor's boundary. Boundaries are not suggestions. Kestrels converted the frigate into parts that could tell a later tribunal interesting stories. The carrier's magazine decided it wanted to be outdoors. The explosion unfurled with a strange, terrible grace. O'Rourke said, "Ban Green has prayers." "Record them," Park said. "Everyone is somebody's story." She blinked once and spoke on a private line Maya didn't intend to hear but did. "Note to myself," Park said quietly. "If we survive this, write letters to the parents. Don't let the job steal that. If the Republic is anything, it is what we do after." War bent its head for a moment and let that sentence pass. Then the Dominion reached for the oldest page in its oldest book. It was a page with fingerprints and oil stains and a torn corner where honor's definition had been updated by committee. Sark-Oth sent the command that cultures write into their blood and pray to never use. Ramming speed. At first, it looked brave. That's how ramming always looks in the histories we let ourselves keep. Hulls redlining, engines coined into light, bows like spears held by the noble and doomed. Courage has good publicists. Ethics departments tend to file it under tragic failure of imagination. The Dominion line broke into vectors made of refusal. 47 hulls, light cruisers, destroyers, corvettes with a grievance, spoiled out of formation and burned straight at Archangel. Not like wolves now, but like bees that had decided the beekeeper was an idea that could be solved with enough stings. Park did not sigh. She did not curse. She moved. "Lattice to mode 6, she said. "Kestrels, harvest teams Alpha through Delta play catcher. Intercept profiles Echo and Foxtrot authorized. Rule set Mercy 1. The Aegis lattice changed its song. Where it had been an orchestra, it became a quilt sewn by a grandmother who had rough-loved children. Fields layered not simply to deflect, but to wrap. A destroyer punched into the outer layer and came out the other side with its bow melted into a soft cone, and its engines thinking very hard about a career change. It tumbled rather than impacted. Kestrels leapt and kissed it with nets that bit like ivy. They hauled it out of the corridor and hung it on a vector that would not kill its crew unless gravity resumed using cruelty for a hobby. 3 rammers did not get the quilt. They were clever in a way clever men sometimes accuse as cowardice when they don't know what else to call it. They pivoted late, cut their transponders, masked their drives in the thermal garbage of their betters, and surfaced inside a distance the rulebooks described as unhealthy. Park let the first get dangerously close. Then she showed why the Dreadnought had been built ugly. Hidden doors in Archangel's flanks blossomed open like a hoodlum rolling up sleeves. The turrets that slid out were not the Dreadnought's opera weapons. They were Barum fists, short-barreled, brutal, built to punch away problems with immediacy. They spat spindles of superheated matter at velocities that make metaphors limp and turned the forward 100 meters of the first rammer into steam. The second found its hull full of holes that convinced it of a sudden belief in sunlight. The third, blessed by luck and terrible aim, scraped the Aegis at a bad angle and lost its starboard side the way an old scab loses the argument with a careless fingernail. "We're still within Mercy One," O'Rourke said, as if checking a pulse. "But Mercy One is bleeding." "Copy," Park said. Ramming wasn't about physics. You could get the same physics with a nice, honest missile. Ramming was ceremony. It was a translation of a culture's fear of irrelevance into sacrament. The Kari at Dominion had built a church of that sacrament, and for centuries the universe had attended, thrown rice, and learned the hymns. Park had no interest in being a parishioner. "Kestrels intercept Foxtrot," she said. "Go inside." Inside meant inside. Interceptors went nose first into Dominion hulls at low enough speeds to be ungentle and high enough to be unforgiving, then unspooled packages named after saints. St. Jude for lost causes, St. Elmo for fire, St. Francis for compassion where possible. St. Francis was a swarm of microbots that ate ammunition fuses and left bulkhead bolts alone. A destroyer that had meant to be a martyr became a patient. Not pretty, but alive. The feed from one kestrel flickered as it gnawed through a spine of cables and spewed foam into a compartment to smother what might have been a last poem. It was ugly business. Ugly business is what you have when you refuse to build the world out of lies. Sark-Oth kept coming. He was not blind to the failure blooming on his plot. He was obedient to a god with a narrow vocabulary. 10 more hulls. 9. 6. He understood at last what Archangel had been doing with Mercy. Not performing, not preening, not even persuading. She had been drawing him away from the station and its children, fattening a kill zone with restraint so that when killing finally came it would fall on metal instead of on faces. He found a channel. "Captain Park," he said, and if his translator was honest, he used a title she had not given him the courtesy of in return. "We will be recorded as cowards if we withdraw, and our grandchildren will carry our names like stones." Park's voice, when it arrived, had the shape of someone who had read old books under a blanket with a flashlight. "Try this," she said. "Tell them you met a civilization that writes its wars so that its grandchildren don't have to. Tell them you were outthought. Tell them you learned. If they call that cowardice, teach them a better word." "Words do not alter history," he said. "They are how we write it," she said. Something happened on the far edge of the plot. It was small and huge at once. A series of slip-space ripples like raindrops almost too polite to disturb a pond. Not near enough to be reinforcements, not close enough to trigger panic. Park had ordered those ripples with a memo 6 months ago that had felt excessive to a procurement officer and delicious to an admiral. They were markers, buoys, set to mimic the entry signature of other dreadnoughts. A lie meant to deliver a truth. We are not alone. O'Rourke's ethics panel flashed green. "Band green rising," he said, almost smiling now. "Someone on a Dominion bridge just said the word option." "Give him a better exit," Park said. "Make me a door that doesn't look like a door." They sent another packet. It contained timing windows, safe headings, archival footage of past humanitarian corridors with enemy ships successfully withdrawing without termination. It also contained, slyly, a short clip of a human history lecture. Just a minute. A professor in an elbow-patched jacket talking about the rare moments when a commander writes a sentence so sane it drags his country with it. The translator rendered the professor's cadence into Kariat syllables with surprising tenderness. Sark-Oth did not conjure a new ethics out of void. He had time only to choose. He chose to live. In a voice that qualified as hoarse in 5 languages, he gave the order. Vectors changed. Engines walked backward off the red line. The last 3 rammers peeled away from death with the clumsy relief of men, stepping out of shoes that never fit. The Dominion line retreated to the 3-0 mark as if teaching muscle memory a new prayer. Archangel did not pursue. It laid its lattice down like a street festival after a blackout and let the evac convoy move through, slow and orderly, and with the solemnity of thresholds. Kestrels babysat the damaged Dominion hulls to make sure none rolled into a bad day. Microdrones winked their soft human blue on captured fighters like fireflies at the end of a July. Maya let herself sit. Her knees did not buckle because knees are heroic only in plays. She looked at the feed from Convoy 4. A nurse with dinosaur stickers removed a cocoon and handed it to a mother whose face told you everything you ever needed to know about policy. Maya touched the screen with 2 fingers, like a benediction no theology would deny. Captain Park came up on Huygens' local private line now, voice tired, edges fraying like clothes that had been washed too many times without the courtesy of a delicate cycle. "Commander Patel," she said, "you did everything right." Maya laughed in a way that sounded like surrender, but of something you would be glad to be rid of. "We got lucky. We invested," Park said. "Luck is compounded interest on preparation." "Is that from a book or a grandmother?" "Both." Silence grew the way flowers do when you stop arguing with dirt. Archangel held station like a mountain pretending to enjoy a lake. The Dominion at 3-0 burned soft, licked wounds, and began rewriting doctrines. Somewhere in those ships, a junior officer would get yelled at for telling his superior that living had been the correct choice. Somewhere else, a grandmother would be told a story that changed the way she held babies. Maya said, "Captain Park, what will they tell the rest of the galaxy? That we are monsters." "They'll tell them we're prepared," Park said without pride. Pride is for days when you haven't learned the cost yet. "They'll tell them that if they leave people like yours alone, they can spend their budgets on museums instead of missiles. They'll tell them we offered them a door. Some will call that door weakness. Some will walk through it. And if they come back with more, then we end it," Park said, and the sentence was not a threat. It was a legal reading of a vow. "Do you sleep after this?" Meyer asked, surprising herself. "On the good nights," Park said. "When the ledger balances in the black for the living. When the kids with the dinosaur stickers get old enough to put magnets on fridges and write thin loops that say don't flinch first." The channel fell to a hum. On a side screen unwatched by anyone who was not paid to worry, one of the slip-space ripples on the edge deepened for half a second. Nothing emerged. The boy did its polite work. It whispered suggestion into the math of anyone watching that perhaps, somewhere beyond that edge. A second dreadnought had adjusted the crease of its sleeve. War is a language, yes, but there are other tongues worth learning. The station's damaged windows caught a new light, not the star's harsh pulse, but something warmer, tug beacons lining a path for the battered evac convoy. The path said, "You are expected." The path said, "The rule of law is also a form of gravity." The path said, "We are capable of a civilization." Maya let her hand fall from the railing. The steel was warm from human palms. It felt like a promise you didn't realize you had been holding until someone else put their hand over yours and squeezed once hard to say, "Same." "Continue," you will say, and the story will. It will follow the letters Park writes and the committee Sark-Oth faces and the doctrine that grows in the dark like a good mold. It will ask, as all good American stories do, what we owe strangers and what we owe ourselves. But for one breath. At the end of a fight we could have made uglier and did not. It was enough to count by 5s. 5 small shuttles, 5 beacons, 5 beats between the stars hammering where a station full of tired, stubborn people rewrote what the next morning could be. The first sunrise after a battle is never honest. Light comes in at an angle that flatters the wreckage, making even charred plates look like sculpture. Huygens relay tasted that kind of morning. Repair drones ticked along scarred trusses like beetles with good intentions. In the medical bay, a girl with a dinosaur sticker on her sleeve insisted her cocoon had roared when it opened. No one argued. on the command deck. Commander Maya Patel read the overnight excerpts of a document that would outlive her. The evidence Ledger Archangel had compiled. The ledger didn't shout. It listed times, vectors, frequencies, the exact angle at which a corvette had aimed at a lifeboat, and the exact moment a kestrel had chosen to bite that angle off. The names of 2 Dominion officers who had ordered a barrage toward a corridor, and the microsecond when those orders were overridden by subordinates who had chosen to be better men. Maya scrolled and felt the strange steadying that numbers sometimes give after a storm. The ledger wasn't righteousness. It was an account book. In America, accountants had saved more cities than heroes if you counted coldly and correctly. "Commander," Chief Morales said from the lift, a grime crescent across her forehead like a second moon. "We've stabilized the eastern radiator fins, patched 3 coolant arteries, and convinced the dish to stop apologizing to the neutron star." She was just being polite, Maya said. "What's our bandwidth? Enough to educate a small planet or annoy a large one. Let's do both." They did the first by opening Huygens' classrooms, what was left of them, to children who had slept in hallways and supply closets. A researcher named Silas, whose speciality was the way dead stars whispered, turned his comm into a lesson on how fear isn't proof, just a very loud hypothesis. A porter named Irene taught knots to kids who had never tied rope to anything that mattered. They laughed when their fingers learned something their minds had not asked for. Maya watched the room settle into the old civilization rhythm. Adults tucking their panic behind work, children siphoning it away without even knowing they did. They did the second by answering a message from the Kariat Dominion's capital, a world of glassy deltas and radioed architecture, the translation suite called Varkale. A council demanded a status report. Another demanded an apology. A third demanded the coordinates of Ussan's Archangel in the narrow tone of bureaucrats who think names make targets. The only Dominion voice that arrived without a demand carried the brittle calm of a witness who'd stayed awake for truth to arrive. "Commander Patel," it said, in Kariat syllables rendered unexpectedly gentle by the translator. "I am archivist Iressa, sworn to record what is embarrassing to our future so that our future can be better at forgetting what is convenient. Stratego's executor Sark Oth has requested counsel. Our war colleges have requested a myth. I would prefer to give them a history. Would your captain accept a conversation recorded under oath?" Maya glanced at the far holoplot where Archangel hung with the immodest patience of a mountain. "Our captain likes oaths," she said. "I'll forward." Captain Naomi Park received the request while drafting letters. She wrote letters the way some people breathe, on purpose. The names were not many. One maintenance tech lost to a pressure door that had loved friction too much. 2 kestrels that had experienced catastrophic re-entry when a Dominion destroyer died inelegantly and scattered debris like arguments. A civilian tug skipper who had insisted on being a wall and succeeded too well. But the ritual did not scale with numbers. Park dated each letter by hand and wrote 2 kinds, one to families in Saul, folded around hard facts and soft gratitude, one to Huygens' children that read like postcards from a place where the law kept the lights on. She copied Mr. Levin without knowing it. Power with aim is policy. Policy with conscience is a country. O'Rourke. At the ethics console slid the archivist's request into Park's periphery. "They want to record you saying we didn't build this ship to polish our honor," he said. "That sentence belongs in their library," Park said. "Patch her through, not live. We edit only for classified tech and names." Iressa's face was not a face. The Dominion didn't love showing faces to strangers. It was an emblem, a softly pulsing knot of light that flickered with the rhythm of someone thinking carefully. "Captain Park," she said, "your doctrine behaved as if we were worse than we are and better than we were. Why?" "Because those are the only 2 mistakes that ever killed civilizations," Park said. "Assuming the enemy is too wicked for mercy and too wise for mistakes. You kept our pilots alive where you could," Iressa said. Is that strategy or belief? You can build a strategy out of belief, Park said. We've tried building it out of contempt. It's stupid and expensive. Your Sentinel directive, public law, requires a dreadnought to answer a research station's call. Iressa let the words register in her own register. That is an extravagant promise. It is cheaper than rebuilding decency from wreckage, Park said. We did the math. On Var Kale, Sark-Oth stood in a chamber that had been built to intimidate guilt. Its columns carved the air into obedient segments. He held his crest in his hands, a whetstone of ancestry smooth from generations of fingers. Tradition told him to wear it to prove honor had a weight. He had taken it off to see if honor could breathe. The Council of Measures watched him with 12 pairs of black-lidded eyes. The room smelled of oils and iron discipline. "You lost," said a counselor whose translated title suggested veto more than wisdom. "Explain how." Sark-Oth tipped the crest stone, let it catch the light, then set it on the floor as gently as if it had been a sleeping animal. "We brought old mathematics to a new proof," he said. "They brought proofs for the mathematics we didn't know we were using." "You speak in riddles to avoid the sum," the counselor said. Sark-Oth thought of the moment Park had cut 2 cruisers in half with a line that had felt like logic becoming mercy becoming fear. "They did not aim to humiliate us," he said. "They aimed to leave enough of us alive that we could learn. Our doctrine did not imagine an enemy with the luxury of such restraint." "A luxury paid for with terror," someone hissed. "Perhaps," he said, "but it was coupled to law and to a corridor lined with lights for children." Iressa recorded that sentence with the tenderness archivists reserve for the thing that might be the hinge. Back at Hygien's, Maya toured the outer ring where the hull had taken the worst of the Dominion's initial attention. She and Morales stopped at a view blister that had crazed but not cracked. Through it, the neutron star pulsed its weird metronome. "We'll be writing procedures out of this for 10 years, Morales said. "Good," Maya said. "Procedures are love letters we write to the next crew. You're getting sentimental." "I slept 3 hours. It always happens." They paused at a scorched wall where a tech had chalked "Don't flinch first" in block letters with a piece of smashed tile. Maya kept walking. She didn't touch the words. Some rituals you don't make official. You let them live by repetition. Archangel transmitted the ledger to 3 neutral repositories and 1 hostile one, the Dominion's own legal archive. "Give their lawyers a long weekend," Park said. "Nothing converts a hawk faster than a reading list with footnotes and evidence stamps that could get him promoted if he stops yelling long enough to understand them." O'Rourke, who had once worn a suit to argue in a room where no one bled and then chosen a uniform to argue where everyone might, said, "Sometimes justice needs theater. Sometimes theater needs transcripts." "You're poetic today," Park said, tired around the eyes. "Ethics console gets sentimental on good mornings." In the afternoon, a message threaded through Dominion relays in a way that citizens not paid to notice would miss. It was a simple thing, a directive from the War Collegium declaring that evacuation corridors were henceforth to be treated as neutral until otherwise ordered. It was not surrender dressed up as policy. It was something smaller and braver, a doctrinal flinch away from cruelty. Iressa attached a footnote. Sark-Oth, who had removed his crest, signed. Maya printed the directive and taped it to the edge of the main plot where only she could see. Then she went to a classroom and watched Silas ask the kids what they thought stars sounded like. A girl with a dinosaur on her sleeve said, "Like a hallway after the bell when everybody runs." And Maya filed that in the drawer where commanders keep the reasons they might cry later. In privacy, quietly, to maintain the ratio of strength to softness that makes a country something worth being scared for. As night came, fake, programmed, merciful, the Dreadnought dimmed its external lights to a pattern seafarers would recognize. A ship at anchor, not threatening, not asleep. Watchful, with the humility of things designed by people who remember history, is a job you stock with adults. The universe did what it always does after men and women refused to ruin it for the day. It kept spinning, pretending not to be relieved. Perigee Hall had been an ore cylinder before a consortium of the stubborn and the traumatized paid welders to make it into something like a courthouse. The welders had left their names on the struts in chalk. Above the dock, the new sign read, "Where facts outlive flags." It was aspirational and necessary. The League of Small Polities had called for a tribunal to adjudicate what had happened at Hygien's relay. Dominion representatives had agreed, reluctantly. The quiet directive about evacuation corridors gave them just enough face to walk through a door with their shoulders squared. Humans sent Archangel's ledger and a delegation with more lawyers than guns. Maya came because Park insisted there should be a commander present who could say "kids" and mean it as an argument. Park stayed with the ship. "Courtrooms are like battles," she told Meyer on a private link as tugs nosed the relay's shuttle toward Perigee. "Every truth needs someone to hold the microphone and someone to keep the lights on. I keep the lights on." Perigee Hall smelled like metal and compromise. A gallery of species that had been stepping around each other for too long filled the benches. On a raised dais, a three-being panel sat beneath a ring of soft lamps. One human judge in a dark jacket that would have looked at home in a Boston courtroom 2 centuries back. One vari adjudicator wrapped in cloth the color of old moss. One Kariat jurist whose presence had required 4 days of haggling about procedures and pronouns. The court translator wore a lapel pin that read "Be kind." Archangel's Advocate General, Commander Priya Bose, stood and presented the ledger as if asking it out to dinner. No flourish, no apology. She walked the panel through the doctrine Park had applied, the United Sol laws of armed conflict that had become less a dusted-off import from an old Earth and more a living set of promises. She played the kestrel footage at precisely the right moments. A non-lethal strike on a Corvette's control bus. A silence field washing fighters into a safe drift. The sheer lance cutting 2 cruisers like facts cutting rhetoric. She called O'Rourke to explain Mercy 1 and Mercy Boundary, the rule set that separated restraint from dereliction. He did so like a teacher who remembers children are in the room. The Dominion advocate rose with the stiff dignity of someone who had reread his brief after a sleepless night and found it insufficient. He argued that the Dreadnought's tools constituted tyranny by asymmetry. He suggested that mercy denatured deterrence. He asked Maya if the station had invited intervention by existing near a neutron star known to be strategically attractive. Meyer answered without blood in her voice. "We invited students," she said, "and anyone who wanted to ask questions without being arrested for curiosity. Our flag is ugly and loud, and we argue about it at family tables every holiday, but in this we don't argue. Research stations are churches for minds. Your captain deployed weapons that destabilize structural lattices," the advocate said. "She deployed words first," Maya said. "She invited your fleet to stop committing crimes. When they didn't, she stopped the harm with enough force to make the stopping stick, and then she stopped using force as soon as she could. I don't know how you translate enough, but that is the word you need if you want to raise children instead of ghosts." Archivist Iressa watched from the gallery, stylus flickering. Next to her sat Sark Oth, not in chains, not in uniform. He had a thin scar along one mandible now. Someone's temper had been clumsy at a debrief. When the Kariat jurist asked if any Dominion witness wished to address the court, Sark Oth stood. The sound that went through the hall was not applause and not a hiss. It was the soft release of 100 people realizing they'd been holding their breath since air had been invented. "I ordered the first volleys at Hygien's," he said. "I chose ramming when doctrine suggested it. I would like to be blamed accurately." The human judge tilted her chin. "Do you also wish to be credited accurately?" Sark Oth took a long time not to answer. "I wish the children on that station to grow up," he said finally. "Credit is for parades. I am finished with parades." The Dominion advocate flinched almost invisibly. Iressa recorded the flinch. The vari adjudicator rested 2 bark brown hands on the bench and said, We are not here for vengeance. We are here because a corridor needs paint that lasts after rain. The tribunal recessed for a meal you could call lunch only if you had learned to be generous with that word. Maya found a corner with a viewport and watched tug beacons realign into the geometry of a temporary safe lane for the traffic that had swollen around perigee since the tribunal was announced. A shuttle slid too fast across the frame. Outside, Archangel's kestrels hung like punctuation in a sentence about law. A whisper came into her ear. Not radio, not telepathy, just the human ability to hear a tone and know it meant trouble. A perigee marshal hustled by, face a map of emotions she wasn't paid enough to have. "What's wrong?" Meyer asked, already moving. "A package," the marshal said. "Freight tag says engineering foam, sniffer says hot. Sabotage loves courtrooms. It understands the power of a bomb during a fragile conversation." The package sat in an alcove behind a hatch painted with a stencil of a wrench. Morales would have laughed at the cliché if she had been there. Maya didn't laugh. She crouched, felt heat ghost through the casing, and opened a line to Archangel that had priority over most gods. "Kestrel 9. This is Perigee Hall Ops," Park's comms officer answered. "State problem. Device, heat build, likely shaped for ducts, suggestion." "Hold," Park's voice said, cutting into the line. "You have 20 seconds to clear the hall. We will help without turning it into a lesson in craters." People responded as if the building itself had raised them, orderly, faster than adrenaline, slower than panic. A kestrel zipped through the vestibule like a hummingbird standing a little too close and parked itself over the package. A nozzle flowered from its belly and misted the casing with a smart gel that made heat feel idle. The kestrel whispered to the charge in frequencies designed to sound like the absence of permission. The device sighed. A Dominion officer in the gallery stood so quickly his seat scraped an admission. The marshal put a hand on his shoulder. "Not today," she said. He sagged as if permission to be better weighed more than fury. When the tribunal reconvened, it did so into a silence that had learned something about thresholds. The Kariat jurist read a provisional finding. The Dominion had violated the corridor. Archangel had applied force proportionate to the need. Non-lethal measures had been used where possible. Lethal force had been disciplined by stated doctrine. Reparations were recommended. Not in treasure. The Dominion would argue that for months, but in public policy. The tribunal would draft a compact. Corridors marked by shared beacons, open to neutral inspection, treated as sanctuaries whose violation would trigger automatic sanctions from more polities than the Dominion could bully at once. They named it the Lantern Accord, after a human general who had once hung lamps in a church to signal routes to people seeking freedom. After the reading, the human judge did something not in the script. She looked down at Sark Oth and said, "Strategos, do you wish to address your academies?" He did. He stepped to the stand and chose words with the care of a surgeon who knows the scar will be on a face. "Cadets," he said into a lens that fed 100 lecture halls, "we have told you that courage is going forward when you are afraid. We have failed to tell you that courage is also going backward when you are wrong. On the day of Hygiens, I mistook stubbornness for honor. Learn a different mathematics. In your lifetime, you will meet enemies who offer you a door. Take it. Live to change doctrine." Archivist Iresser wrote the next line herself in the record's margin where future students would see it and wonder why margins were ever optional. He set down his crest. Outside, the traffic of a rebuilt world resumed. Inside, Park sent a short message. "Good, now we make it boring." Boring was the goal of grown nations. Boring meant ambulances arrived on time, schools stayed open, courts didn't need kestrels. Boring meant the thrill seekers would have to find their dopamine in foolish sports and badly written novels instead of wars. The tribunal adjourned. There were handshakes that counted and handshakes that were photographs in search of donors. There were arguments about jurisdiction that would spill into committees for years. But when Maya stepped back onto Hygiens's shuttle, the pilot said, "You smell like a library," and she said, "Thank you," as if it had been a compliment. It was. The thing about deterrence, Park often told junior officers, is that it behaves like a garden. It needs tending. It needs fences where deer jump. It needs signs that say no picking the strawberries, and it needs a child to come by and pick one anyway just to test whether the sign is a bluff. The war collegium in the Dominion, those who had lost arguments in public and wished to win some in secret, picked a strawberry. They chose Hygiens again because spite is lazy. A courier drone, disguised as a salvage canister, drifted into the relay's patch of space with the patient innocence of trash. Inside, nested like ugly matryoshka, were a microfoundry, a printer of soft explosives, and a coil of bugs designed to learn human maintenance schedules and bite when the lights were out. The device latched to the station's underribs and began to print an argument it intended to win without debate. It had been printing for 7 hours when Ensign Brooks noticed a shimmer where a shimmer shouldn't be. He didn't sound important when he said so. "Chief, the bell is misbehaving, like a dog dreaming at the foot of the bed." "Dogs are excellent early warning systems," Morale said, and took a tug with 7 tools and 1 superstition out to the underribs. There she found the drone's work, a budding like frost on a window, except the frost had ambition. She didn't touch it. She called Maya, who called Park, who didn't say "I told you so," at least not on a recorded line. Archangel came close enough to see its own reflection in Hygiens's battered panels, and sent a kestrel with a payload labeled SD Francis Roman II. This version sang to the printer in a voice the printer had been designed to love, its own. The printer believed it had already printed. It went to sleep dreaming of jobs well done. The microfoundry sulked into a safe mode. The soft explosives felt unappreciated and uncooperative. Morales peeled the drone off the ribs with the same gentle contempt she saved for people who misused torque wrenches. "Who sent it?" Brooks asked. "Someone who thinks tests are a way to undermine teachers instead of a way to learn," Maya said. "Catalog it, pack it in a box, we'll save it for the museum." The Collegium's second strawberry was uglier. A cell on a border world took hostages in a small clinic, where a grandmother taught children how to boil water without wasting heat. They broadcast a list of demands that read like a freshman's manifesto and ended with a promise to kill someone on the hour. Park did not flinch. She sent a message to the Dominion's new corridor office, a bureaucracy so new its chairs still squeaked, and said, "Joint response?" The officer who answered wore bewilderment like a new coat. "We have never done that," he said. "You will like it," Park said, and sent him a packet that laid out who would say what to whom in what tone. Words are equipment, too. The joint response arrived with 2 shuttles, 1 human, 1 Kariat, and a path through the clinic drawn by an algorithm that had learned to love life more than it loved elegance. The hostage acres had prepared for soldiers who would kick down the front door. They had not prepared for medics who came through the roof with foam and needles, or for a Kariat negotiator who spoke to a scared young man in the dialect of a province that hadn't felt seen by its capital in 2 generations. The first round someone fired put a hole in a heater and a bruise on a son's pride. No one else bled. The grandmother came out into the light carrying a pot of water and told the cameras in fluent Dominion that men who frighten children are bad at math. It was better television than the Collegium had planned. It was harder to recruit off that kind of television. Park slept 3 hours and then wrote 2 letters. One to the grandmother, with a recipe for cornbread that had survived her own grandmother's migrations, and a rough invitation to speak to cadets via relay. One to a young Dominion officer who had volunteered for the joint response, and whose eyes on the footage looked like someone discovering a planet. She told him that the world he'd been told to fear had bakeries and bureaucrats and a very stupid sport involving an oblong ball, and that if he came to a game, she would teach him how to boo politely. Meanwhile, the tribunal's lantern accord needed more than signatures. It needed hardware, shared beacons planted along corridors, broadcast on the League's public channels, audited by a third party that charged too much and was worth every credit. Archangel ferried the first crate to a scrubbed-clean chunk of space halfway between Hygens and a Kariat mining coupe. The beacon unfolded into a sculpture of angles and patience. Its heart held entangled keys that allowed parties to confirm what had passed when without arguing about who had faked a timestamp. The beacon hummed itself into the background after 20 minutes. That was its job, be there and be boring. Maya took to teaching a class she had not known her uniform included. Civics in vacuum. The students ranged from 8 to 40. The syllabus was rude to ideology and generous to evidence. She passed around printouts of the lantern text and asked for edits in little hands. You could anchor a civilization in small rituals like that. In sentences, toddlers learn to recite and teenagers learn to criticize. Irene, the porter, added a unit on knots. A corridor is just a big rope, she said. Learn what rope does when you pull stupid. News of Sarkoth's speech to the academies reached Hygens the same day the War Collegium tried a third strawberry. A smear campaign. A video artfully edited suggested Archangel had fired first and without warning. The lie lived for 11 hours, which is a lifetime in the economy of outrage. Then Perigee Hall's server, under the Lantern Accord's transparency clause, posted the uncut recordings with 3 independent verifications. The lie died without flowers. Some called it a witch hunt. Others called it the rent due on the privilege of having opinions. That night, the children of Hygens sent a message to Archangel. It wasn't written by a public affairs officer. It was a sheet of paper taped crooked to a console and broadcast without polishing. It said, in letters the size of Sirius, "Thank you for keeping the hallway quiet." Park printed it, folded it like scripture, and slid it into the same drawer where she kept her grandmother's recipe. On difficult days, she would take it out and let the letters steady her hand. Sarkoth watched the message from a room in Varkale that had belonged to a warrior poet who had died before the Dominion learned to conjugate the verb to doubt. He watched it twice. He then authored a rule his enemies would call weak and his grandchildren would call obvious. Ramming is reserved for debris mitigation, never for ships with people in them. He wrote the footnote himself. We are no longer bees. In the quiet between alarms, Meyer and Morale stood once more under the neutron star's patient cruelty and considered the scorch where Don't Flinch first had been chalked. It had been scrubbed during a repaint. She reached up with a pen and wrote it again, smaller this time, just above a seam. She didn't tell anyone. Superstitions survive by not asking permission. Years don't pass in war the way they pass at a picnic. They accumulate in ledgers and scar tissue and policy manuals that start out slim and end up taped together. Hygens kept teaching. Archangel kept patrolling. The Lantern Accord grew a bureaucracy that irritated poets and saved shipping captains from early graves. The War Collegium lost budgets to a new ministry with a name so dull it had to be genuine. Office of Corridor Compliance. We have invented our least sexy enemy, Park said at a staff briefing to laughter that sounded like health. The second test of the Accord came from a place neither human nor Kariat, a loose federation of raiders who wore thrift store ideology and liked the sound of glass breaking. They didn't care about doctrine. They cared about attention. They jumped into a marked corridor with a barge full of stolen ore and a camera, intending to make a point about hegemonies and hypocrisy. Archangel met them at the line with no rhetoric at all. Kestrels disassembled their drives until the raiders were too busy not dying to narrate. A Vari patrol, varnished bark hulls and engines that sounded like old songs, arrived with a tow. The raiders went to a court with a judge who had once been a farmer. The camera recorded the process of boredom. Park gave a lecture at Perigee Hall titled, The Maintenance of Peace as an Engineering Discipline. She did not bring slides of weapons. She brought diagrams of supply chains and stories about electricians. She told 3 truths cadets copied down with the desperation of test day. 1. Mercy is logistics. 2. Justice is a scheduling problem. 3. Deterrence is a promise you keep in public so the private monsters learn to do math before they do harm. She cited no battles. She cited a bakery on Hygens that had reopened with a partition of sunlight on the floor exactly where it had been before the shells hammered the glass. Sark-Oth retired. The council tried to give him a parade. He refused the street and accepted a bench in a school where he taught a course with an untranslatable Kariat name the translator rendered as hard stops. He opened the first class by placing his crest on the table and saying, "I carried this for years until it carried me. Do not become objects made by your ancestors." He invited archivist Iressa to guest lecture on the power of good margins. She made the cadets write their doctrine footnotes by hand. Maya received a note from Mr. Levin, the real one, aged and stubborn, his email signature still containing a quote about the necessity of boredom in republics. He wrote, "You did what I tried to make you do when I was mean about your essays. You turned theory into floors kids can run on." She forwarded it to Park with the subject line, "Civics, graded." There were bad nights because history never empties its pockets. A convoy failed a fuel calculation and drifted. 3 beacons glitched in sympathetic embarrassment. A commander on a far frontier mistook rumor for law and paid for it with a pension reduced by consequences. Park had to use the sheer lance again once, to make a point she would have preferred to deliver with a pamphlet. The world is not so good that pamphlets always work. Afterward, she walked Archangel's spine alone and touched the armor with her palm, as if checking that the cold was still there to remind her not to run hot. She whispered an apology to the empty space where the enemy's hull had been, and then wrote a letter to the family of a deckhand who had slipped in a moment that would have been clumsiness if the ship had not been designed by people who understood clumsiness kills. On the anniversary of Hygens, they held a ceremony no one planned, and everyone showed up to. The lantern beacon nearest the relay pulsed a soft amber at dusk. A mother whose child had outgrown dinosaur stickers placed a paper ship in the airlock and watched the fans carry it up to the window where it bounced and caught the light like a tiny resolved argument. A choir of engineers sang a song about torque. Maya spoke briefly because long speeches after long years feel like theft. She said, "We survived by counting by 5s. 5 rules we never broke. 5 hands we always took when offered. 5 minutes of patience when pride wanted action. 5 times we checked the math where fear tried to round up. 5 names we wrote on letters so we would remember who peace is for." She didn't list the rules because anyone who needed them could go ask a librarian. Park beamed the ceremony to Perigee Hall and to Varkale. In the Kariat school where Sark-Oth taught, a cadet raised a hand and asked if the Dominion had become weak. Sark-Oth said, "We became readable," and the class wrote it down as if it tasted like a new fruit. That night, as Hygens slept and Archangel watched and the neutron star pulsed like a god learning to breathe through worry, a new message arrived in a channel reserved for maintenance requests and small human miracles. It came from a mining coop with a name translated as Stone Trust, signed by a foreman whose hands looked like maps of work. It read, "Lantern corridor shortened our haul by 3 days. We bought a library. Send us a syllabus." Maya forwarded the note to Silas with a picture of a chalkboard. He wrote back, "Unit 1, How Dead Stars Sing. Unit 2, How Living People Listen." After midnight, Morales walked the ring and paused where the seam marked by "Don't Flinch First" was still visible. She put a fresh layer of sealant over it so it would last through temperature cycles. "Superstition," she muttered and patted the words anyway. In the morning, a boy in the classroom asked why the Archangel was called Archangel. Maya told him it was because sometimes you need a name that reminds you who you are supposed to be while you're doing things no one should have to. He nodded solemnly and drew the ship as a mountain with wings. Before she slept, Park opened the drawer and touched the paper that said "Thank you for keeping the hallway quiet." She checked the ship's lists one last time: food, fresh water, spare parts for beacons, blank paper for letters, and sent a note to O'Rourke. Start drafting the civics curriculum for the new corridor inspectors. Keep the jokes clean. End with the line about mercy being logistics. People remember the metaphors that make them shop for the right screws. On Varkale, archivist Iressa finished a book not meant to be a myth and therefore likely to survive into one. It ended with a sentence a poet would have ached to steal. On the day we learned the shape of the human dreadnought, we learned also the shape of our better selves. A door held open with a hand nobody forced us to take, and the strangely difficult courage of walking through. The neutron star kept pulsing. It would be there long after names peeled off walls. The beacon kept humming. It would be replaced and audited and sworn at by techs in bad moods, and saved by kids who would become techs because a teacher had passed them a wrench at the right age. The station kept teaching. Archangel kept its ugly, beautiful watch. And when the corridor lights came up every morning, amber to green promised to practice. Somewhere a grandmother, on a world with a name no human would ever pronounce quite right, stood in a doorway and called children to school with the same ordinary authority that binds democracies. You are expected.